Marina started her day as usual, getting up before dawn in her small apartment. The old alarm clock barely rang as she quickly turned it off so as not to wake her younger brother Yura, who was still sleeping sweetly. His pale face and intermittent breathing reminded her of the illness that was slowly wearing him down. Preparing a modest breakfast, Marina thought about the money she needed to pay for her brother's medication. Her cleaning lady's paycheck was barely enough, and the bills seemed to multiply every week. Today will be better, she told herself, adjusting her gray uniform before going to work. The luxurious corporate skyscraper was a stark contrast to Marina's life. Every morning she walked through the glass doors with a shy smile and headed straight to the locker room to start her workday. She was invisible to most of the staff, which deep down suited her. On this day, Igor Vasilyev, the owner of the corporation, was a strain of the ordinary. The millionaire, known for his indifference and strict standards, was preparing for an important meeting with foreign investors. His impeccable appearance and arrogant posture made him an intimidating figure to everyone around him. Everything had to be ready. "I will not tolerate mistakes today," he ordered his team before heading to the meeting room. Marina, meanwhile, was quietly cleaning the hallways nearby, noticing the nervousness of the staff as they bustled about preparing for the meeting. When the time came, Igor entered the meeting room with his legal team. The investors were already waiting, reviewing documents and exchanging calculating smiles. Marina, who had been tasked with quickly cleaning the room before the meeting began, tried to be inconspicuous as she wiped down the table. The doors closed, but not all the way. From her position in the hallway, snippets of conversation could be heard. One of the investors, an older man with a strong accent, was insisting that Igor sign the contract immediately. "This is an opportunity not to be missed, Mr. Vasilyev," he was saying. Igor replied with a cold tone, "I don't make hasty decisions. My team will check everything before we proceed." Despite his firm stance, Igor seemed under tremendous pressure. Marina, already finishing her work, froze in place when she heard the name of one of the investors. Her heart sank. This was the man associated with the financial collapse that had ruined her father's life many years ago. Memories of that painful era came flooding back to her. Her family had lost everything to the fraud that had left her father gone. Without a second thought, Marina felt an uncontrollable impulse. She quickly entered the conference room, ignoring the surprised looks of those present. "Igor Nikolaevich, stop. Do not sign this contract," she said in a trembling but determined voice. The hall plunged into silence. Igor slowly rose from his chair, his face expressing a mixture of bewilderment and anger. "What are you doing here?" he hissed with contempt in his voice. Marina, sensing that she had crossed a dangerous line, lowered her gaze but did not back down. "I just want to warn you, this man is unreliable. My family lost everything because of someone like him," she pronounced. Igor looked at her with a cold, studying sneer. "And who are you to tell me what to do?" A cleaning lady eavesdropping on other people's conversations. His words cut like a knife. But Marina didn't move from her seat. "I have nothing to lose, Igor Nikolaevich." "I just wanted to warn you," she said, not hiding the tremor in her voice. Igor grinned sarcastically and turned to his team. "Take this woman out and make sure she never interrupts me again." Marina was led out of the hall, her heart racing and tears coming to her eyes. She had risked her job, but knew she couldn't have done otherwise. Even as the meeting room doors closed behind her, she could still hear the muffled voices inside. Inside the hall, Igor tried to quickly regain control of the situation. His face was impenetrable, but there was tension in his eyes. He glanced at the investors, whose attention was clearly distracted by the sudden intrusion. "I apologize for the misunderstanding," he said calmly, not giving away his emotions. "Sometimes it's hard to avoid situations like this. My employee apparently just got overexcited. We'll definitely look into it." The investors glanced among themselves, and then the older of the two, a man with a thick foreign accent, spoke up. "Mr. Vasilyev, we understand that this sort of thing happens, but this situation—" He paused quite unusually. "Are you sure it's under control?" He nodded, remaining confident. "Of course, I appreciate your understanding. We can continue our discussion." Nevertheless, the atmosphere in the room was heated. The investors were chattering, and Igor noticed how their moods had begun to change. They were no longer so favorable. After another half an hour of discussion, the investors came to the conclusion that it would be better to postpone the meeting. One of them, apparently wanting to avoid unnecessary suspicion, said, "Mr. Vasilyev, perhaps we should continue the negotiations another time, when everything will be more appropriate." Igor nodded, realizing it would be useless to insist now. "Of course, gentlemen. We will agree on a new date and continue our dialogue. Thank you for your time." When the investors left the room, Igor was left standing alone. He took a deep breath, trying to suppress his irritation. His thoughts involuntarily returned to Marina. Her words, her determination, and the way she had stormed into the hall now kept him on his toes. He couldn't just ignore what had happened. Marina, meanwhile, had returned to the restroom where she always left her things. Her hands were shaking and her heart was still pounding with anxiety. She knew that her act could cost her her job, but she had no other choice. Her memories of the past were too strong for her to remain indifferent. Sonia, her co-worker, noticing Marina's condition, immediately ran up to her. "What's wrong? You're shaking all over," she asked, trying to calm her friend down. Marina looked up at her with eyes full of tears. I, I intervened in the negotiations. I told Igor Vasilievich not to sign the contract. It was wrong, but I couldn't do otherwise." Sonia sighed, looking at Marina with surprise and concern. "Do you realize that this could end badly? Igor Vasilievich doesn't tolerate this sort of thing." "I know," Marina whispered, lowering her head. "But I couldn't keep quiet. They're just like the people who ruined my family." Sonia said nothing, but her face expressed a mixture of sympathy and fear for her friend. That night, sitting in his office and studying documents, Igor Nikolaevich kept returning his thoughts to the cleaning lady who dared to interfere in his affairs. "Why does it bother me so much?" he thought, looking at the contract with disbelief. Meanwhile, Marina returned home with a heavy heart. Igor's words were still ringing in her ears, evoking feelings of shame and despair. Her modest uniform was wrinkled and dirty after a long day of work, but she paid no attention to it. The first thing she did when she entered the apartment was look at the bed where her brother was resting. "Yura," she called softly, approaching to stroke his forehead. The boy opened his eyes with difficulty and squeezed out a weak smile. "You're late today," he said. Marina smiled, trying to reassure him, though inside she was shattered. "Tough day at work, but it's okay," she replied. She got up and started cooking dinner from what was in the modest pantry. As she stirred the soup in the pot, the tears she had been holding back all day came in rivers. "Why couldn't I have kept quiet? What am I going to do now if I get fired?" she thought. Meanwhile, Igor sat at his massive glass desk. The contract he had almost signed lay in front of him along with other documents. He couldn't get Marina's words out of his head. "That man is unreliable. My family lost everything because of someone like him." The young woman's face, her look of courage and despair, flashed before his eyes again and again. He sighed heavily and pressed the button on the to-call assistant. "Clara, bring me all the additional information on these investors." "I want a full analysis," he ordered. "Of course, Mr. Vasilyev," his assistant replied with professional courtesy. While he waited, he leaned back in his leather chair and looked out at the lights of the nighttime city. He tried to convince himself that his distrust was just part of his usual caution, but he knew that for the first time in a long time, and something was all wrong. Marina went to work the next day, feeling as if every step she took was bringing her closer to her sentence. Her colleagues, though treating her kindly, cast curious glances at her. The news that she had cut the meeting short in the boardroom had spread quickly among the staff. "What were you thinking, Marina?" a co-worker whispered as they changed in the locker room. "I don't know. Just felt like I had to do it," Marina replied, trying not to show her anxiety. "I hope Igor Vasilievich doesn't decide to fire you. You know what he's like," they said. Marina nodded silently, realizing that her colleagues were right. Igor Vasilievich was known for his ruthlessness to those who questioned his authority. Igor continued to delve deeper into the data on the investors. The more he studied the documents, the clearer it became that Marina might have saved him from disaster. The financial records revealed uncertain transactions with dubious intermediaries, hidden lawsuits that had never surfaced before, and many contracts that had driven other companies into bankruptcy. Putting all the facts together, Igor felt his irritation rising. He realized that the team of analysts who had verified the investor data should have been responsible for this. Their negligence jeopardized not only the company's reputation, but also its future. He pressed the intercom button. Clara, get the analyst who was in charge of vetting these investors on the line. Urgent, he said, his voice cold and harsh. Of course, Mr. Vasilyev, she replied. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man with a wary look entered the office. It was Viktor Sergeyevich, the senior analyst who was in charge of reviewing transactions. You summoned me, Igor Vasilyevich? He asked, trying to look confident. Igor looked up from the documents, his face expressing restrained irritation. Sit down, Viktor Sergeyevich, he said, pointing to a chair in front of his desk. The man sat down, visibly nervous. Explain to me how you could have missed such information. Igor began sharply, tossing printouts on the table with details of dubious transactions and lawsuits. Viktor Sergeyevich frowned, taking a cursory look at the documents. Igor Vasilyevich, me. We vetted the investors using standard protocols. At first glance, everything looked clean. He tried to justify himself. At first glance? Igor interrupted him, rising abruptly from his chair. This isn't just negligence. You put our company and the thousands of employees who depend on us at risk. Do you realize what this could lead to? Viktor Sergeyevich swallowed nervously. Yeah, we can do a re-inspection. I'm sure we can rectify the situation. Igor looked at him with disdain. It doesn't matter anymore. I don't need apologies and promises. I need results. And if you can't handle such an important task, then you have no place in my company. But Igor Vasilyevich, Viktor tried to intervene. That's enough, Igor said firmly, returning to his chair. You're fired. I can't afford to work with people who are incapable of securing our transactions. Viktor Sergeyevich turned pale, but did not argue. He realized that it was no longer possible to correct the situation. All right, he replied briefly, standing up. Thank you for the opportunity to work here. He left the office and Igor was left alone. He sat in silence for a few more minutes, trying to quiet his irritation. This situation had shown him how important it was not to rely solely on formalities and protocols. After speaking with the analyst, he called the company's general counsel. Alexander, I want to suspend any negotiations with these investors until we have full information, Igor ordered. May I ask what made you change your mind, Igor Vasilyevich? The lawyer asked. Igor paused, remembering Marina's face. Let's call it intuition, he replied briefly. That same day, Marina returned home with a heavy heart. She was still worried about the possible consequences of her act. Yura, upon seeing her, struggled to rise on the bed, holding a pencil and an old notebook. Mari, I finished another drawing, he said with a smile. Marina sat down next to him and looked at his work with interest. The paper depicted a large, cozy house surrounded by a garden with flowers and a bright sun in the sky. That's wonderful, Yura. We'll definitely live in a place like this someday, she said, trying to sound confident. Really? He asked, a glint of hope in his eyes. Of course, honey, Marina replied, kissing him on the forehead before heading off to make dinner. But her thoughts kept returning to Igor. Why hadn't he done anything after her intervention? At the same time at the corporation's main office, Igor was in his office. The contract and related documents lay before him again. He couldn't ignore the evidence that was increasingly confirming Marina's case. Another thing that bothered him was how she could know about these people. The next day, walking past one of the restrooms, he noticed Marina cleaning the windows. Their gazes met for a moment, and Marina hurriedly averted her eyes, feeling her heart racing. But Igor did not say a word, continuing on his way with his usual imperturbable posture. However, that brief glance left Marina tense for the rest of the day. She was sure that she would soon be called to announce her dismissal. At the end of the workday, Marina made up her mind. She went to her boss, Irina's office, to clear the air. Marina, what can I do for you? Asked Irina sternly, looking up from her papers. Irina Sergeyevna, I wanted to apologize for my action. I know I went beyond my authority, but I couldn't keep quiet, Marina admitted honestly. Irina looked at her carefully, mixing sternness with curiosity. Igor Vasilyevich, a man who is hard to impress, let alone interrupt. You could have lost your job on the spot, she said. I know, but I thought it was the right thing to do, Marina replied, lowering her eyes. Irina paused for a moment before continuing. No orders have been issued regarding you yet. Carry on with your work as usual. Don't worry. Marina left the office with a slightly relieved heart, but knew that uncertainty still hung in the air. Igor watched from his office as Marina left her boss's office. Over the years, he had learned not to trust people, especially those who tried to influence his decision. However, this woman had not only risked her job, but she didn't seem to expect anything in return. Looking through the stack of documents on his desk, he sighed heavily. For the first time in years, someone had disturbed his usual cold world. Marina, meanwhile, tried to hang on, continuing to go about her daily duties. She couldn't shake the feeling that Igor was watching her. Every time she heard footsteps approaching, her heart began to beat faster. Her thoughts were racing. He still hadn't done anything. But what if this was the calm before the storm? Igor, for his part, was delving deeper into checking the documents about those very investors. With each new fact discovered, Marina's suspicions were confirmed. Violations, hidden machinations, bankruptcy of companies, all this pointed to their dishonesty. Now he was sure they were trying to cheat him. That cleaning lady saved me from disaster, he thought, feeling a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. He wasn't used to relying on anyone, much less someone from so far away from his world. The next day, Marina came to work with her usual sense of anxiety. She waited for the day when he would fire her, but it wasn't happening. As she was washing the windows on the top floor, Igor Nikolaevich walked past her again. This time his gaze was different, attentive, almost studying. "Good morning, Igor Nikolaevich," Marina said quietly, trying not to meet his gaze. Igor nodded faintly in response and continued on his way. But even that brief moment left her in excitement for the entire day. Later that afternoon, Igor made the decision to find out more about Marina. With a couple of clicks, he opened her personnel file. There was nothing unusual there. A punctual, hard-working employee without any disciplinary offenses. But one detail caught his attention: her home address and a brief note about her marital status. Dependent brother. Mother deceased, he muttered as he read the file. Although there were few details, it was enough to realize that Marina's life had not been easy. Her story, full of sacrifice, awakened a strange sense of discomfort in him. He realized for the first time how far her world was from his own. Marina came home later than usual. Yura was sitting on the bed, doodling in an old notebook. His face remained painfully pale, but joy shone in his eyes when he saw his sister. "Marie, I drew another house today. Do you want to see it?" he said cheerfully. "Of course I do," she replied as she came closer. The drawing showed a family, a boy, a girl, and a man standing in front of a large house with a garden. "We're going to live in a place like this, aren't we?" Yura asked hopefully. Marina smiled, but inside she was torn with pain. "Of course we will, Yura. We'll definitely be happy," she pronounced, hugging him. But as she prepared dinner, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened and why Igor Nikolaevich still hadn't fired her. The next day, while she was cleaning the meeting room, Igor suddenly entered. Marina froze, feeling everything inside stinging. "Igor Nikolaevich, hello," she greeted quietly, putting the rag aside. Igor folded his arms across his chest, his gaze focused. "You are an unusual woman, Marina," he began. "I am?" she struggled to utter, trying to remain calm. "Few in your position would dare interrupt an important meeting and address me the way you did." Marina lowered her gaze, feeling herself blush. "I'm sorry, but I just did what I thought was right," she replied, clutching the rag in her hands. Igor stepped closer, his voice softer. "And how did you know these people were unreliable?" She hesitated before answering, then took a deep breath and met his gaze. "Because my father lost everything because of people like them," she said, barely holding back tears. Igor fell silent, feeling the weight of her words. He realized that behind the modest figure of the cleaning lady was a story he knew nothing about, a story that explained her courage and perhaps her pain. Her voice was quiet and trembling, but she continued, "You probably don't understand why I intervened anyway, but I couldn't stay silent. These people, they remind me of the man who destroyed my family." Igor, who had been listening to her with a stone face, looked at Marina intently. Her words hurt something inside him, but he didn't interrupt, letting her continue. "My father? He was a good man. Worked his ass off to make sure my brother and I had everything we needed. He dreamed of a better life for us. When a man approached him with the promise of a big investment, my father believed. He put everything we had into that project. Marina paused to deal with the lump in her throat. But it was a lie, a deception. That man was gone, and we lost everything. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. We lost our house. We had no money left. Dad couldn't handle the blow. The stress and guilt killed him. He died. I was still a teenager then, but I had to take care of my younger brother. Yura was just a baby. Since then, I did everything I could to keep him safe and in need of nothing. Igor was silent, but his gaze was focused. He saw in Marina not just a cleaning woman, but a person who had endured more pain and suffering than he could imagine. Marina continued already more firmly. The day I heard the name of one of those investors, I thought it was the same person or someone related to him. Maybe I'm wrong, but I couldn't stay away. I know how I cheat people like my father, and I couldn't let anyone else get hurt, not even you. She fell silent, realizing she'd said more than she'd planned. Her breathing was ragged, but she felt light, as if a huge weight had fallen from her soul. Igor finally spoke, his voice low but calm. You've told me a lot, Marina, more than I expected to hear. I am grateful for your honesty. He stood up, looked at her again, and slowly walked out, leaving Marina alone with her thoughts. She didn't know what would happen next, but she felt she had made the right choice. Sitting in his office, thoughts of Marina did not leave him. Her words, her look, it all reminded him of how little he knew about the people working for him. He tried to focus on his work, but again and again his attention returned to her. He glanced at the city outside the window and felt strangely uneasy. Her words made him wonder. What kind of life is she leading? What path has brought her here? He pondered. The next day Marina continued to work, trying not to think about her conversation with Igor. She felt vulnerable after revealing part of her story to him. Sonia, her friend, noticed her condition. Are you okay, Marina? She asked during a pause. Yes, I'm fine. Marina tried to smile. You don't look convincing. Did something happen? Is it to do with Igor? Sonia continued. Marina only shook her head, not wanting to share the details. But deep down she knew that Igor had somehow changed since their conversation. She felt his glances, caught the smallest changes in his behavior, though he tried not to show it. Igor, meanwhile, was sinking more and more into thoughts about Marina. He couldn't ignore her story, her courage and her pain. He pulled up her personnel file again to make sure her story was honest. What he learned shocked him. Her father had, in fact, been the victim of fraud, had lost everything he had. This collapse destroyed the family, and the man himself was killed in a confrontation with the man who had defrauded him. This information caused Igor to feel a sense of guilt. Without thinking, he picked up the phone and dialed the number of one of the investors they had met earlier. A confident voice sounded in the receiver, but Igor got straight to the point, not giving his interlocutor time to greet him. Good afternoon. I have decided not to negotiate with your company anymore. All contracts are canceled, he said firmly. A silence hung on the other end of the line that lasted only a few seconds before the investor's irritated voice rang out. Mr. Vasilyev, what does this mean? Do you realize that this could affect your reputation? Such decisions are not made so easily. His voice grew louder and louder. Igor remained calm, but his tone was unwavering. I care less about my reputation than I do about the integrity and safety of my company. I'm not willing to make deals with people who hide such a dubious past. The investor didn't give up. His voice became more aggressive. You are making a huge mistake. We could have cooperated and achieved great results. Your behavior is rash. You will lose more than you will gain. Igor frowned. His patience was at an end. If you think you can intimidate me, you are mistaken. My decision is final. No more meetings. Our paths are parting. This will not end simply, Vasilyev, shouted the investor. Igor grinned coldly and replied, So be it. With these words, he decisively pressed the end call button. The handset returned to its place with a muffled click, and his gaze went to the window. He felt a mixture of relief and anger. On the one hand, he had made the right choice, but on the other hand, he was annoyed by the manner in which they were trying to pressure him. Igor let himself take a deep breath, realizing that this step was necessary. Images of Marina and her story came back to his mind. Her courage, honesty, and steadfastness had become an example to him. For the first time in a long time, he felt that he was on the right path, even though he knew that the consequences were still ahead. That same evening, Marina returned home. Yura, seeing his sister, smiled at her from the bed. "Sister, you look tired today," he remarked. "Not much, little one." "Just a lot of work," she replied, sitting down next to him. "Are you thinking about your principal?" Yura suddenly asked. Marina looked at him in surprise. "What makes you think that?" she asked, trying to hide her embarrassment. "Because you always have that face when you think about him," he said with a sly smile. Marina laughed, though she felt her cheeks redden. "Don't make it up, little one." "I'm just thinking about how to solve all our problems," she replied, hugging him. But Yura, tucked into his pillow, continued to smile. The next day, Igor made a decision. "Clara, invite Marina to my office," he said to his assistant. Marina, receiving the summons, felt her heart sink. She didn't know what to expect. A second anxiety ran through her body, but she pulled herself together and went to see him. When she entered, Igor Nikolaevich put aside his papers and looked at her with a serious expression. "Marina, please sit down," he began. Marina, feeling very tense, cautiously sat down opposite Igor. Her hands trembled slightly, but she tried to remain calm. Igor, folding his hands on the table, looked at her carefully before he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, Marina," he began, his voice sounding softer than usual. "And I've been studying the documents related to these investors. You turned out to be right. These people were indeed trying to deceive me." Marina looked up, surprised by his words. "I didn't expect you to believe me," she admitted. Igor continued, his gaze a little softer. "I rarely listen to anyone, especially people I thought were far removed from my world. But your story, it made me think. You've been through a lot, and your courage deserves respect." Marina felt her eyes fill with tears. She hadn't expected to hear such words from a man she considered cold and arrogant. "Thank you, Igor Nikolaevich. It means more to me than you realize," she replied quietly. Igor paused for a moment, as if pondering his next words. "But I would like to discuss more than that. You said you are caring for your brother and sacrificing everything for him. That takes incredible strength, Marina." Her heart sank. She hadn't expected him to know such details. "I can't leave him. He needs my help," she said, trying to hide her embarrassment. "You're as my family. He's brave and always cheers me up." Igor nodded, listening to her intently. "I want to help you," he said with sudden determination. "Cover medical expenses for your brother. You shouldn't have to bear this burden alone." Marina opened her eyes wide, not believing her ears. "But Igor Sergeyevich, I can't accept this," she began, feeling mixed emotions. "It is too much. I don't want to be a burden to you. You pay my salary as it is." Igor leaned forward, his gaze serious but warm. "This isn't charity, Marina. It's a way of saying thank you. If it weren't for you, my company could have suffered huge losses. You deserve a reward like no other." Marina couldn't contain her emotions. Her pride struggled with the realization that helping her could have saved her brother. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't need to say anything," Igor replied. "Just accept my help." Marina was silent for a long time, then finally sighed. "All right, just for my brother's sake, I'll accept your help," she said weakly, her voice trembling. Igor nodded, a slight smile appearing on his face. "I'll organize everything. Don't worry." The next days flew by like a blur. Igor did everything to ensure Yura's treatment. He hired the best doctors, organized the examination, and bought all the necessary medicines. Every time Marina saw her brother begin to gradually recover, her heart was filled with gratitude, but also mixed with questions. Why is Igor doing this? And what does he see in her? One evening, Igor decided to visit Marina at home. It seemed necessary for him to understand her life better, to see what else he could do to help. When Marina opened the door and saw him, she was stunned. "Igor Sergeyevich, what are you doing here?" she asked, looking at him confusedly. "I wanted to see how your brother was feeling." "May I come in?" calmly he asked. Marina hesitated a little, but then opened the door wider. The apartment was small with minimal furniture. However, everything looked clean and neat. Igor looked around the furnishings carefully. Worn chairs, worn wallpaper, everything spoke of a hard life. Yura was lying on the bed, but when he saw Igor, he struggled to get up on his elbows. "Are you the one helping my sister?" he asked with childlike directness. Igor came closer, smiled, and sat on the edge of the bed. "Yes, I am. And rather not to your sister, but to you. How are you feeling?" "Zranya, on sprosil glядя на мальчика." "Better, thank you very much," Yura replied, his voice weak but sincere. "My sister says you're the best." Igor shifted his gaze to Marina, who stood off to the side and watched their conversation in awe. "Your sister is a true heroine. I'm just trying to say thank you this way," he said, smiling at the boy. After Igor left, Marina sat next to Yura for a long time, stroking his hair. "This man, he's strange, isn't he?" Yura suddenly said, looking at his sister with a smile. Marina laughed quietly. "A little," she replied, but her thoughts were in turmoil. Igor Nikolaevich had changed since she had first met him. He no longer seemed to her only cold and arrogant. His actions made her wonder about his true nature. Meanwhile, Igor felt a strange warmth in his chest as he walked home. He rarely allowed himself to be vulnerable or emotional, but Marina and her brother had touched something inside him. The encounter left a lasting impression. In the days that followed, Igor began to find more and more reasons to cross paths with Marina. He would linger in the hallway when she was cleaning, or he would go into the common areas where she was working. Though he maintained his professional posture, there was a softness in his gaze now that Marina noticed, but didn't understand. He couldn't ignore that Marina had changed his perspective on many things. She had taught him to see more in people than he used to notice. One evening he sat in his office, looking out at the city lights. Her image never left him. He felt that her strength and sincerity had broken down the wall he had been building around him for years. The next day he made a decision. "Clara, organize a dinner at my house. Invite Marina and her brother," he said to his assistant. "Of course, Mr. Vasiliev," replied Clara, asking no questions, but surprised by his request. When Marina received the invitation, she was confused. She was not used to such gestures and did not know how to react to it, but Sonia, her friend, persuaded her to go. "This is your chance, Marina. You deserve to rest and feel important, especially with someone like Igor Nikolaevich. You'll be the envy of all your colleagues," Sonia insisted. Marina hesitated but finally agreed. The evening of dinner came. Marina came in a simple but elegant dress, which Sonia helped her to choose. Yura was excited and smiled all evening. When they entered Igor's apartment, they were greeted by the owner himself, looking relaxed but reservedly cheerful. "Welcome," he said, smiling warmly. The evening passed in a warm atmosphere. Yura happily told stories, and Igor listened to him with sincere interest, sometimes throwing attentive glances at Marina. She, in turn, felt her tension gradually fading away. When dinner came to an end, Igor walked them to the door. Before they left, he took Marina's hand. "You've changed a lot of things in my life, Marina," he said quietly. "I want you to know that it matters to me." Marina, confused, only nodded, not knowing what to say. But something new was flowing in her heart, a feeling she was afraid to admit. Several days passed after the dinner at Igor's. Marina could not stop thinking about that evening. His words, his look, everything left a deep imprint in her soul. She had never encountered such attention, especially from a man who lived in a completely different world. But her fears and doubts never left her. One day during her lunch break, Sonia approached her with a conspiratorial smile. "Marina, have you noticed that Igor Vasilievich is often looking for you?" she asked. "Sonia, stop it!" "He's just wondering how Yura's doing." Marina brushed it off, trying to hide her embarrassment. "Yeah, sure," Sonia piped in. "You just don't want to admit the obvious." "Dinner, I think. What was it for Yura?" Sonia laughed. Marina only shook her head, but her thoughts went back to Igor. Her heart was beginning to believe that his interest might have been something more, but reason said it was impossible. Igor, meanwhile, was also confused. He felt that Marina had become someone special to him, but he didn't know how to convey that to her. Her modesty, her strength, and her selfless love for her brother made him admire her more and more. He realized that their lives were too different, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to push his feelings away. The next day, Igor invited Marina to his office. When she entered, he rose from behind his desk and gestured her to the chair opposite. "Marina," he began, his voice quiet but determined, I want to talk to you frankly." She tensed, not knowing what to expect. "I realize that our lives are quite different," he continued, "but since you came into my life, a lot has changed. You've shown me what it means to be strong, honest, and caring, and I want you to know that you're more than just an employee to me." Marina looked at him confusedly. His words stunned her. "Igor Nikolaevich," she began, but he interrupted her. "Please just call me Igor," he said with a slight smile. Marina lowered her gaze, feeling a blush flood her cheeks. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't need to say anything," Igor replied. "Just let me be there for you. Let me help you and Yura, not just because of obligation, but because it's important to me." Marina felt her heart fill with warmth. She hadn't expected to hear such words from a man she considered unattainable. That night, Marina couldn't sleep for a long time. She looked at the sleeping Yura, thinking that her life in recent weeks has changed a lot. For the first time in a long time, she had hope, but with it came doubts about whether she could afford to believe in Igor's feelings. The next day, Igor did not wait. He again invited Marina and Yura to his place for dinner. This time, he wanted them to feel part of his life. When Marina and her brother arrived, Igor met them at the door. His smile was warm and something sincere shone in his eyes. "Welcome," he said. Yura immediately ran up to Igor, showing off his new drawing. "Look, I drew you and Marina," he announced proudly. Igor laughed and accepted the drawing, then turned to Marina. "Your brother is a real talent," he remarked. Dinner passed in a relaxed and warm atmosphere. After the meal, when Yura dozed off on the sofa, Igor suggested that Marina go out on the terrace. Under the starry sky, he looked at her and quietly said, "Marina, I would like to ask you one question. Are you ready to let me into your life? Not just as a helper, but as someone you want to be around?" Marina stared at him, not knowing what to answer. Her heart was pounding and her mind was full of thoughts. But she saw the sincerity in his eyes and realized that for the first time in her life, she could allow herself to trust. She began, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say. This is all so sudden." Igor smiled, his eyes glowing with softness. "I just wanted you to know that you're more to me than just someone I want to help. You're more than that to me." Marina felt her eyes fill with tears. She tried to smile, but her emotions were too strong. "Thank you," she said in a whisper. "You have no idea how much your words mean to me." Igor slowly moved closer, but he didn't rush her. He just stood by her side, letting her gather her thoughts. After a few moments of silence, Marina looked into his eyes. "I'm afraid," she said, "afraid that our world is too different, that this could all end before it's even begun." Igor smiled slightly, his voice sounding confident and calm. "The difference in our worlds doesn't matter if we both want to be close. This is only the beginning, Marina, and I am ready to walk this path with you, whatever it may be." Marina nodded, her heart beating faster and faster. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. In the days that followed, life began to change for both of them. Igor became more and more involved in Marina and Yura's lives, showing that his words were more than just a promise. Several weeks had passed since that evening, when Igor and Marina decided to move forward together. Their lives were slowly beginning to take on a new meaning. Yura was recovering, his energy and joy were returning, and the relationship between Marina and Igor was growing closer. The wedding was modest, but incredibly touching. The ceremony was attended only by the closest friends and colleagues. Yura, in a neat suit, proudly stood next to his sister, holding her hand. When Marina approached Igor, her eyes shone with happiness. "You're everything I've ever been looking for," Igor whispered as he looked at her. "And you are my new chance at life," Marina replied with a smile. When they exchanged their vows, the hall filled with applause. It was a moment that forever remained in their hearts. After the wedding, Igor, Marina, and Yura started a new life in a cozy house outside the city. The house was surrounded by a green garden, which Yura had always dreamed of. Every day was filled with joy, laughter, and caring for each other. Yura, fully recovered, ran around the garden with a kite, while Igor and Marina watched him sitting on the terrace. "You know," Igor said, taking her hand, "I never thought I'd be this happy." Marina looked at him warmly. "And I never thought I deserved a life like this," she replied. Igor smiled and squeezed her hand tighter. You deserve all of this, and more. You changed my life, and now I want to make your life what you dream of." They sat on the terrace, enjoying the warm evening and the view of the stars. At that moment, they both knew that despite all the trials they had been through, there was only happiness ahead of them.